Welcome to Press Coverage. I am Theo Gremminger, and at Press Coverage, we're looking to bring in the sharpest guests and looking to help you find the edges you need to win in fantasy football. And I'm excited today to be joined by John Daigle, now of Establish the Run. I podcasted with John a number of times. One of the sharpest guys in the business, can talk about literally any single subject, and we're going to try to hit a bunch of them that I think are going to get you some actionable information for your fantasy drafts headed into almost July here. John, unofficial start to redraft season nationally, I feel like is 4th of July. You're in the streets drafting right now. You're putting out content. How is everything doing today?
Everything's going well. We tried to schedule this show much earlier, last month actually, but so much has happened in between then. I've been on the road touching grass at various locations around the country, coming fresh off an entire week where the in-laws were in town. So lots of hosting and tourism things going on too. So everything is finally settled. I'm about to start diving into redraft content, season-long stuff alongside Evan Silva at Establish the Run. So I would say, yeah, it's ramping back up for everyone now.
Yeah, and everybody at Player Profiler in our audience was following your work when you were at 4 for 4. John did a tremendous job there. Really excited for what you have in store. Can they hear you on some podcasts right now, John, or is that going to ramp up later this summer?
It's about to start ramping up, but honestly, if you just follow the flagship Establish the Run podcast, I would imagine it'll be me hosting, maybe sometimes by myself, maybe sometimes Adam Levitan hosting with me on it, but I will be on a lot more moving forward.
Awesome. We are definitely looking forward to that. And we're just going to get started right away here. Every guest that steps on Press Coverage and Dynasty Life gets these same two questions. You're doing your rankings, you're in the streets drafting. If you could know the final stats of any single player this season, who would it be? And let's specifically leave this as a veteran player, non-rookie.
Does Achane count as a veteran since it's his second year?
100%.
Then
a stud veteran.
That's the route I'm going then, regardless of if you start your drafts with one of the big three in Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, and Bijan Robinson, or gloss over them for one of the big 3 or 4 top wide receivers. The fact is, hero and anchor RB builds at the top of drafts pretty much rely on, if you want to start with an Achane, a one running back, and build from there, rely on, in my opinion, Achane, because he's the one who consistently falls to that mid-second, third round turn. I'm going to be overweight on him across the board for sure. But if I could know his final stats, that would be tremendous, since he already showed he's a player who breaks the game of fantasy football, available in the second round on timeshare opportunity. But in my opinion, as everyone continues to draft Raheem Mostert, he's just a great hedge against Raheem Mostert, who is fresh off not only a career high in fantasy points per game and touchdowns in his 9th season in the league, but he was also the first running back, Mostert was, age 31 or older, to average at least 18 points per game since Tiki Barber did so in 2006. It's just a situation we want to hedge against. We want to bet against Mostert. And to do that, we can bet on a player who, again, already on a minimal touch share, still broke fantasy football. What if that opportunity suddenly increases? So to me, it's not only I'm building my drafts around Achane. Because I'm doing that, I would love to flip over those cards and see what his final tally is. If his role increases, if it stays the same and he's as efficient, it's obviously going to be very hard to average over 8 yards per touch for his entire career. But what does regression for a player of his style in a Mike McDaniel's offense look like? That is something I would love to know.
I love it. And I'm not allowed to talk about him because people in the chat always say that this is like a DeVonta Achane hype channel. And I love bringing on guests that are also bullish on Achane. And I'll say this, if you're going to if you want to go with a modified anchor approach, especially for FFPC drafters, you can get DeVonta Achane at the 304, 305 in a lot of drafts right now. I can follow up with Jalen Wright in the 11th, and it's a backfield I'm comfortable double tapping regardless of format. And if the Raheem Mostert fade is correct, you might end up with a starting running back and also a flex. And I'd be perfectly comfortable starting those two if Mostert did miss time. John, I think that would actually be an exciting high EV strategy. Your thoughts on double tapping that backfield?
Sure, because everyone is assuming that Jalen Wright takes away from Achane. But yes, what if Jalen Wright is just the big upright one-cut speedster like Mostert is, and then also gets involved over Mostert instead, especially because for his entire career, we think Mostert is injury prone, and we think he could get injured again coming off a healthy season. So yeah, I can totally see that happening.
And also, one other thing is the receiving upside for DeVonta Achane. I think it's funny because we don't hear a lot of people talking about this, where last year at this time, the reports out of camp were he's so effective catching the football, he's going to have this weekly role in this offense as a pass catcher. And then that narrative sort of like just kind of disappeared because the guy was so effective running the ball. But I think the upside is there where he could be utilized a lot more this year as a receiver, and that could be part of the weekly game plan in Miami. I think the sky is really the limit for him. What about a rookie, John? Is there a rookie player that you're dying to know the stats of?
A rookie player is interesting. I think I draft right now the most between Trey Benson and Rome Odunze. And I don't even know how Odunze fits into what this new Shane Waldron Bears spread offense is going to be. But the way drafts are happening right now, it is assumed that Keenan Allen or Odunze are falling behind DJ Moore in what is logically an ambiguous situation. And so that's why I like taking chances on both Allen and Odunze much later than Moore is being drafted right now, even though Moore is obviously talented. Again, we just don't know the situation. New quarterback, new offense, new play calling. So I like to take chances on the other guys too. But for Trey Benson, you know, it's again just a bet on injury-prone player like James Conner, who will give you usable weeks for both best ball and redraft. He's someone I will be targeting. I believe he goes right now in the 8th, 9th round. You can correct me on that at FFPC. Yep. Him and David Montgomery always like linger a little longer than I think they should. So I draft him and David Montgomery quite often. But for James Conner, I think everyone's trying to project 17 games when that only happens really for Christian McCaffrey and no one else. The rest of the time, we need to be talking about fantasy football pockets. And James Conner, as we saw last year, ended his season before he got injured, 5 consecutive games of top 12 finishes. And so that's the kind of player I know I can use. Having said that, with the injury history, we also think Trey Benson can get involved and what we think is going to be a much more explosive offense under Drew Petzing and Jonathan Gannon, not to mention adding a full year of Trey McBride since Zach Ertz blocked him last year, a full year of Trey McBride with Kyler Murray, and of course, Marvin Harrison Jr. So I like drafting Trey Benson as well behind James Conner.
I like Benson a lot. And I think you bring up Conner, where this is a guy that's continually missed games. And it's sort of the recency bias for drafters is everything sort of went right last year. He had a career high in rushing yards, a career high in efficiency. And now he has this real threat behind him. Plus he's 29 years old. So it's an interesting balance. I think if Conner stays healthy, he could end up being like this year's David Montgomery. But if he doesn't, Trey Benson, I think any week that Conner is sort of out of the way, Trey Benson would be an RB1. That's how bullish I am on this offense. So that's an interesting one. And you bring up Drew Petzing heading into year 2. Yeah. Arizona's certainly referenced. You talked a little bit about Chicago with Rome Odunze. There's a bunch of offenses that people are kind of painting a narrative and a picture that could really, really ascend and improve this year. What's one offense that you think could hit in a major way and carry multiple players to ADP wins?
It's already being carried out in terms of ADP at almost all their positions, but I think the Falcons is the most obvious answer here, since we are moving away from Arthur Smith, who was literally dead last by a full 16 percentage points in 3 wide sets, passing from 3 wide receiver sets last year, and going to Zach Robinson, who's coming from the Sean McVay tree in the Rams. We've seen with Kevin O'Connell and everyone else come out from under Sean McVay. They always lean on that exact type of mold, 11 personnel, passing heavily from it. I would imagine that's what we're going to get in Atlanta with Kirk Cousins as well. What's funny though, especially on a site like FFPC where tight end premium, we're getting the boosted scoring. This is going to happen in home leagues too. Like, I don't know how many people will be in the wild west of home leagues on here. It might happen for a little bit in FFPC main events. We'll have to see where it settles. But Kyle Pitts is left over honestly. And I think it's because people are just tired of drafting him. It's still very early into his young career. We've only been through 3 seasons, but people are leaving him. I think we have a full round or 2 more where we just have this like free bumper on Pitts, who is not following the way of Drake London and Bijan Robinson as getting the Zach Robinson boost that they obviously should. And for Kyle Pitts, it's easy. Like, regardless of what you think of him as a player, the fact is he's literally been top 2 in depth of target every season in his first 3 years in the league. And I think that's because Arthur Smith only sent him out on go routes and deep routes with bad quarterbacks who didn't have accurate targets. Like, so now it doesn't only come down to what if Kyle Pitts gets more accurate targets. You have to say, what if he finally starts getting a little more routes closer to the line of scrimmage? He gets those layup points that Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, TJ Hawkinson, all the tight ends who delivered in fantasy get those easy routes near the line of scrimmage. Kyle Pitts never got them. I think he could get them in what is going to be a much more pass happier offense. So I like Kyle Pitts in the Falcons offense this year.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is Pitts is, like you said, there's always going to be some drafters in your league, regardless of format, that are never going to draft him again because they don't want to get burned there. So you already get a little bit of you're drafting against like 8 drafters instead of 12. And he's younger than Trey McBride, younger than Dalton Kincaid. And the last time we saw him, really perform well, rookie season, steamed up in ADP, but his rookie year, the touchdowns weren't there. But tail end of his career, Matt Ryan led Kyle Pitts to 1,000 receiving yards as a rookie. So we've already sort of seen it. If this offense takes a big step forward, he could end up being the really big ADP winner because he's going to be one of the threats to lead all tight ends in targets this year if it's as consolidated as we think. And Bijan, I think, could be break fantasy type guy, but you're paying RB2 overall for him. And Drake London, wide receiver 10 right now in the 350s. So I feel like we're sort of drafting Drake London towards his peak, even though, if him finishing wide receiver 10 would obviously be a help to your fantasy teams. Let's, one more kind of fun question is your favorite this year's version of. Do you have one, John? A player that could be this year's version of, you can just cite the ADP winner from last year. We've had a wild mix of answers for this one.
Everyone has probably targeted other positional players, wide receiver, running backs. I'll go to quarterback because I do think it's a year where we're all struggling to find an actual late round option. Like, we're taking Baker Mayfield, Aaron Rodgers, and Derek Carr. I don't know. I don't know how much all of them have left in the tank at all, if they'll be usable at all, honestly. So to me, I go a little bit beyond that, especially in best ball leagues right now. And I'm taking chances on Drake Maye and Bo Nix. Drake Maye, it's really hard to pinpoint when he will start. Will Levis, it was so obvious whenever you saw that the Titans had a top 5 toughest schedule before their bye, then that bye week planted firmly in the middle of their season, we knew they would come back out and start Levis. That was easily projectable. But the Patriots have a weird one where like they would have to wait till close to the end of the year, according to their bye week, to start Drake Maye. They have a London trip, but not only are they not getting 10 days rest following this London trip in week 4, I believe, it's going to be a short turnaround too, and there's no bye week after that. So I don't know when the Patriots necessarily start Drake Maye, assuming Brissett gets the first game the first month of the season. But the fact that Maye averaged 9.4 rushing points per game in his 2 years starting in North Carolina, we want to be high on him for sure if he were to start 10 plus games. And then Bo Nix, it's the same thing with Justin Herbert, where no one, myself included, projected him correctly. The archetype guy with a big arm, above average athlete as well, who was just engineering Oregon's potent offense. I feel like Bo Nix threw the 3rd most screen passes last year solely because that was his job, orchestrating Oregon's offense. I don't know who he is as a pro quarterback, and the fact that he has all the tools, even as much as no wide receiver, running back, Bucky Irvin, Troy Franklin, these guys didn't get drafted till day 3. And considering Oregon was one of the best offenses in the entire country, you have to think it's because Bo Nix carried them. So who is Bo Nix? That's why I'm drafting him like in the last rounds, because he's pretty much going forgotten as a potential 17-game starter who only need to beat out Jared Stidham to start in week 1.
I like what you're doing there because you're attacking the beat up offenses and finding, instead of trying to chase the positional player, you're betting on these two quarterbacks with sort of unknown upside that the market is sort of ignoring, that have big time scrambling potential if it hits right. And it's not going to kill your build because they're, of course, so beat up. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about John's targets, John's fades, some flag plants. We're going to talk about it all. Stick with us here at Press Coverage.
This episode is made possible by Underdog Fantasy, and Underdog Fantasy is the leader in best ball. When you go to join an Underdog Fantasy best ball draft, it fills very quickly, especially now. It's Best Ball Mania season, baby! Best Ball Mania 5! I can't believe they're at Best Ball Mania 5 already. $15 million in prizes. They're giving out $15 million with $1.5 million to first. Playing in best ball leagues makes you better. It helps train you on player value and strategy. And Underdog offers a lot more than just best ball contests. They offer pick'ems. My new favorite, the golf pick'ems. But they have the NBA pick'ems, baseball pick'ems going on throughout the offseason. Hit the pick'ems, back to best ball, hit the pick'ems. So use promo code Underworld. Promo code Underworld gets you a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. So they've increased the maximum deposit bonus. It was $100. Now it's up to $125. When you get the Underdog app, use promo code Underworld and go draft your ass off.
Welcome back to Press Coverage. Theo Gremminger with John Daigle of Establish the Run. We're going to talk a little bit of draft strategy. Again, July 4th, right around the corner. For a lot of you FFPC drafters, NFFC drafters, your big drafts start ramping up around then. A lot of home leagues now are drafting earlier and earlier, and everybody's drafting on Underdog. So, John, let's just dive into it. One position that's interesting is when a wide receiver 2 gets steamed up in ADP. Last year, we actually saw some significant ADP losses from this range. DeVonta Smith started the season out super slow, ended up having a pretty strong second half of the year. We call him kind of neutral. Jalen Waddle, a slight loss from where you had to draft him last year. T. Higgins, absolutely a pretty significant loss. So last year, the sort of steamed up wide receiver 2s didn't really return any value. Let's talk about some steamed up wide receiver 2s right now. Deebo Samuel is going as the number 2 wide receiver on San Francisco. We've got Cooper Kupp, a huge gap between him and Puka Nacua. DeVonta Smith back at it, but at a more reasonable price. And Stephon Diggs going lower than we've seen him in quite some time. And obviously Jalen Waddle is up there as well. Who would be the wide receiver 2 that you would bet on the most? Waddle's going off the board as wide receiver 14. He's sort of the highest one right now. Deebo, wide receiver 19. Cooper Kupp, wide receiver 20. So we don't have to pay quite as much as last year. Where are you at on this one?
And Waddle will always be a boomer bust type of player since he relies on efficiency, which he's very good at. For me, my favorite, although I don't mind any of them, I like Cooper Kupp as well, who for PPR finishes the wide receiver 24 in points per game. So it seems like we're still getting a really good value, assuming he's at full strength this year. But DeVonta Smith is still my favorite. Just buying back into this Eagles offense through the air after last year when Jalen Hurts was battling a concussion and a high ankle sprain over his last 9 games and just very clearly was not the same player at all. Just 6.5 yards per attempt, averaged only 6 carries per game in that last 9-game stretch. Like previous to that, he averaged over 12 carries per game. He just clearly wasn't the guy. We saw that in the playoffs too, whenever they were already in Cabo from the time the game kicked off against the Bucs. So I'm just betting on this Eagles offense again. And also, again, I in particular say betting on it through the air because I think Saquon Barkley remains the easiest fade in all of fantasy football at his current salary. So if I can get the whiplash of elite quarterback, which I'm very high on this year, maybe we can talk about that later, getting Jalen Hurts in the 3rd or 4th round, and then also like DeVonta Smith before that, that's the plan I usually take. I don't know how much the target tree expands for Philadelphia, especially since we'll have Barkley underneath. And Dallas Goedert, we think at full strength. But the fact that A.J. Brown and Smith still accounted for 51% of this team's target share, 70% of their end zone targets as well, it just seems like even expanding the target tree doesn't mean much because AJB and DeVonta will still claim so much of the target tree. So I like Smith over all the others.
I love where you're at with Smith, and also he's so cheap right now. The last 2 seasons he's finished as a wide receiver 1 2 seasons ago, but points per game wise was wide receiver 14 in points per game. Then last year, wide receiver 20 in points per game. He just got rewarded with a big contract. He's 25 years old, and he's being drafted as wide receiver 23. It feels like we have a lot of upside drafting him at wide receiver 23. And like you said, the Kellen Moore offense, I think, has me excited as well. 112 targets last year for DeVonta Smith. I think he'll definitely be closer to his 2022 total of 136 with room to grow there. So that's definitely an interesting one. Let's keep this going. Let's talk a little bit about the dead zone. So I did an article about this, and I'm still sort of including these round 3 running backs in the dead zone because that's the classical definition of the dead zone. There's been some pushback. Obviously, years back, these running backs that are like the low-end RB1 types, the high-end RB2 types, those guys were going around earlier and sometimes around and a half earlier than where they go now. Do you think that this is we should sort of redefine the dead zone and maybe consider it starting in round 4? Or do you think this is fine to continue looking at it in this way because these guys will sort of all have some kind of a flaw pushing them to round 3? Or do you think they're sort of pushed to round 3 simply because of the wide receiver steam and the wide receivers in round 2 really don't have as sterling a profile? Sort of a nuanced question here, John. It's a big philosophical one for you, sort of your approach now to the modern dead zone.
The overarching view of fantasy football this year is that everything got bumped back. That's the issue, where with receivers going heavier now in those first 2 or 3 rounds, then you get to, as you mentioned, what is considered to be the start of the dead zone, round 4 and 5. And then you look at the running backs from there. The thing is about drafting the running backs there. I try to step back and look at it and not take my own personal, not try to treat it as a personal bias against the Derrick Henrys, Saquon Barkley's, Jonathan Taylor's of the world. Like, I like some of these players individual, but I would argue we haven't seen this many red flags for these top running backs in the last decade, if ever, honestly. Even Jonathan Taylor, like, if you like his talent, you can still easily poke a hole immediately in his role by saying he's with a rushing quarterback who, it was only 4 games, but Anthony Richardson literally led his position in rushing points per game last year. And so what does that do for a player like Taylor, despite what we assume getting the touches, since he was an every down back last year when healthy? And so to me, it's about like dodging that grouping. But to back to your question, you are dodging that grouping by going to other strong positions. Like it's not just the fact that the running back dead zone now starts a little earlier. Everyone got pulled back. It's the fact that quarterbacks and tight ends also got pulled back. And so like I'm being asked to draft like Jalen Hurts or Josh Allen over Travis Etienne. That's the easiest thing I've ever done in my life. It's the same thing for like T. Higgins, George Pickens. These guys are now also being pushed up in like elite tight end ranges. We've seen George Kittle fall behind. I know Brock Bowers is getting steamed up a little bit later, but still someone we want to bet on as a rookie. He plays indoor games as well, weeks 15, 16, and 17. The Raiders are the only team to play 3 consecutive indoor games for the best ball playoffs. And so that to me is what defines fantasy football this year, is not going for that group of running backs because you're taking the elite players at other positions instead. So it's not about like the conversation of which running backs we like or don't like. It's the fact that I can grab Dalton Cater someone over these guys that we really are only taking because we have to start 2 of them every week.
Yeah, and you also sort of alluded to the ability to go hero RB this year, where we feel very good about those backs in the first round. It's pretty easy click when you have Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson and certainly Christian McCaffrey in front of you. But let's stick with it because, you know, we're going to focus in on this area in the draft. Last year, we had 5 of the top 6 RB scorers going somewhere in that dead zone or slightly later when it came to Raheem Mostert. You had Breece Hall as RB2, Raheem Mostert RB3, Travis Etienne RB4, Rachaad White as RB 6, and who am I forgetting? RB5, and then Joe Mixon RB6. So all of those guys sort of dead zone, and Mostert a little bit later. When you're looking at this from a classic dead zone argument, 3 running backs sort of stand out in this round 3. Derrick Henry, Achane, Travis Etienne. They're all sort of going in this little cluster in FFPC right around the 2-3 turn. One back goes in front of them. We're going to talk about it a little later, John, but specifically looking at those 3, Derrick Henry, Achane, Travis Etienne, which one are you betting on at value there?
Achane, as we talked about earlier, is the player I'll probably have. Honestly, he'll probably be my highest rostered player across redraft and best ball leagues. The other one, although I don't mind Derrick Henry, I still treat Kyren Williams over Derrick Henry. I know you didn't mention that as an option, but I want to make sure I'm still high on Kyren Williams as well, who, again, if we're poking holes in these players, also I understand it comes down to workload. Sean McVay historically has leaned on one running back, so I'm not so much worried about Blake Corum as it stands. I still think he has to earn a role behind Kyren weekly. So I take Kyren, especially after the Rams devoted so much salary into their offensive line. They clearly showed they're trying to build a new structure within their 11 personnel base. And then I'll take Derrick Henry after those group as my third favorite. Derrick Henry, I don't even so much like as a player, honestly, in fantasy football. We haven't seen him since he had a career high in touches. Same thing that happened to Josh Jacobs, who I'm sure we'll talk about later. But after 390 plus touches, it's shown historically that running backs just fade. They fall off the map altogether. They just can't handle it. Derrick Henry has been the anomaly. Having said that, since his 390 plus touch season, where he averaged 5.4 yards per carry, he clearly hasn't been the same player. He hasn't sniffed. He hasn't come close to 5 yards per carry in any season since. The good thing about Henry, though, is that the structure of the Ravens offense doesn't change. Regardless of what Henry is right now or becomes, with Lamar Jackson, as much as we want them to pass more, they will not, because Lamar Jackson is just not that type of player. He still engineers a run-first offense with Henry now. So Henry's the one who I think the floor is just safer when I'm talking about which 3 I'll take.
I like the way you put that. And I think that it's Henry. It's even if you're betting on sort of a regression, if he's in a elevated Gus Edwards role, he's going to fall in the end zone 12 plus times with the ability to sort of rip off some big runs. So in that round, I think he's a structural bet. And like you said, I mean, I'm kind of done trying to fade him, because for years we faded really good seasons. I mean, we're talking about him 3-4 years ago as a guy to fade because of age and regression, all that kind of stuff. So he always is there. One thing that's interesting is he continually is leading the NFL in rushing attempts per season.
Yep.
We'll be interested to see if that continues in Baltimore. I think that's sort of an X factor, is the volume for Henry. He's a guy who sort of imposed his own will on the offensive coordinator and the system, but Baltimore scored a ton of points last year. Lamar Jackson, Mark Andrews, Zay Flowers, they've got a lot of guys there. It'll be interesting to see kind of how close he is to the NFL lead there this season.
Especially because the way Derrick Henry, who he is as a player, he naturally creates 8-man boxes. Teams purposely stack boxes against him. And so if they're going to do that in Baltimore again, it actually leaves the door open for us. I know you're high, for instance, on Zay Flowers.
Yes.
But it leaves the door open for us to attack Lamar Jackson, Mark Andrews, Zay Flowers, instead of Henry, thinking that Lamar's going to play against a lot more man coverage, single stacks like that. Same for Andrews. So I think the best way to do it, honestly, although again, I will anchor Derrick Henry when he's there behind Kyren and Achane in that order. I think the best way to leverage it is through Baltimore's passing game, thinking Henry helps them out the most rather than himself.
I like that a lot. And I'll take one off show sheet question for you. And I think it's interesting because Henry, either you kind of love him at ADP or you're kind of fade him. But we've seen for years people sort of chasing the handcuff for Derrick Henry. The argument is in the preseason, the wheels are going to fall off. This is the year that Derrick Henry just falls away, and let's draft Tyjae Spears aggressively, or Darrington Evans aggressively, or Hassan Haskins aggressively. Mm-hmm. It's been sort of a hive of people fading Henry, attacking the handcuff. Now Henry's older. and no Baltimore Ravens handcuff or potential backup gets drafted anywhere. Like even on Underdog, you rarely see the RB2 in Baltimore drafted even in round 18. FFPC, they're ignored even in the 20 round 350s. If you had to bet on us using significant waiver wire capital this year on Keaton Mitchell, Justice Hill, or Rasheen Ali, is there one of these players you could see that could end up being a guy who is one of the big waiver wire additions of the year? I've leaned towards Mitchell personally just because I've seen it. And in the Todd Monken offense, like he's not going to start the year. He'll be there on the waiver wire. And he had like 4 RB2 or better weeks last year in like 8 games. So I'm sort of on him. But is there an argument to be made for one of the others, or you agree with me on Mitchell?
For me, it would be Mitchell. I wish I had a better idea of his timeline. It seems really ambiguous, like midway through the year, into season right now. But also, I'm just a sucker for. I always go for ceiling in the last rounds, and I understand on best ball, anywhere you play, the last round is not like redraft leagues. Like we have to get the last round right. Those players have to be on the field because you can only show up to the playoffs and maybe even the championship round with so few dead spots. You don't know what kind of injuries you're going to deal with. So taking on that extra risk is pretty scary for best ball. Redraft, we know we only draft ceiling in the later rounds, and we can cut those guys after week 1 if we need to with ease. But for Keaton Mitchell, like when you show me you can get over 100 yards and have a top 5 week on just 3 touches, as he did last year, that's a player I still target and just say, I'll cross my fingers you're back in the last month of the season. So to me, it is Keaton Mitchell above all else.
One edge that we've been able to find as drafters is ambiguous backfields. When a winner sometimes emerges of these backs that are drafted close to one another, it ends up being a significant ADP win. And I'll give a shout out to JJ Zacharias. And John, I didn't even realize that ambiguous backfields was something he came up with. And then like I dove into it and I'm like, wow, JJ came up with this term. So another win for JJ on that one. But let's talk about these backfields because there's a lot of clustered backfields this season. Let's do just a rapid fire and add any context you'd like on this one. Let's go with Tennessee. These are ADPs coming from the FFPC $350 contest. So this is a 20-round redraft contest. Shout out to Fantasy Mojo. This is data from his site. Highly recommend subscribing to Fantasy Mojo. Tony Pollard at RB29 and Tyjae Spears at RB30. This is about as close as it gets. Do you have a bet on this backfield?
For me, it's Tony Pollard. Just going in terms of betting against players that don't fit into the buckets of what we are envisioning they become. This was the Alexander Madison argument last year. Prior to that, it was the Mike Davis, Chase Edmonds. The list goes on, arguments for the history of fantasy football. This year, it's very easily the Zamir White argument where he just doesn't belong in this round and ADP of buckets that everyone's trying to fit him into. For me, it's still pretty easy to bet against a Tyjae Spears, and you didn't ask about him, but Chase Brown as well, as undersized day 3 backs. It is scary for Spears in particular. I'm not so much worried about Brown. I'll take a pop shot on him from time to time, but I'm pretty confident in Zach Moss, honestly, just as someone who has in his history, even as recently as last year, been treated as an every down workhorse. Usually coaches favor those kind of guys over these day 3 role players. For Spears, though, when he did get the opportunity, he was great. He was the same guy he was at Tulane, where absolutely no one could tackle him, and he was a machine after the catch and after the carry. He was great. My thing is for Tony Pollard, though, despite his inefficiencies, which I know we're all still hurting from last year, despite his inefficiencies, he still was a workhorse. He got the same workload as Travis Etienne. The difference is Etienne scored touchdowns. Tony Pollard did not. So no one's upset at Travis Etienne for being inefficient. He fell forward, at least when he was inside the 5-yard line. Pollard could not. Also, though, remember, we were only 1 year removed from only having roughly 150 touches as the 1B back behind Ezekiel Elliott, and Tony Pollard still finishes the RB9 in points per game. Like, he's shown in a timeshare he can be a top 12 option in RB1 weekly. And so that's the kind of guy I prefer to bet on in these situations. I have a firm stance over Tony Pollard over Spears this year.
And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. And I've talked about this with Billy Muzio, who's actually bullish on both players in this backfield, has both sort of higher ranked. Nelson Sousa, one of the better high stakes drafters around, was my guest on Press Coverage recently. He's betting on both of these guys as well. I think you hit one really strong point there, John. Well, you hit a bunch of strong points, but one point that stood out with me was the efficiency for Tony Pollard. This is more like it for him to have a second back working in. We think about sort of the years where we were just pounding the table to get him more touches in Dallas was alongside Zeke Elliott, whereas last year, certainly coming off an injury, but he was sort of asked to be the man. Maybe he's better suited in this role than before. So that's sort of a post-hype sleeper argument for Pollard. Let's keep this going. You talked a little bit about Moss and Chase Brown, but here's another backfield. Would you prefer drafting James Conner RB23 or Trey Benson RB34? And we talked about this earlier, both guys, but if you could have one on your roster at those ADP prices on FFPC, underdog drafts, they're like running back 27 and RB30. They're neck and neck. Little bit of a gap in FFPC. The unknown upside or the guy who ended the season well last year as an older veteran?
It's such a cop-out. Even thinking if there was one back to run away in a Titans backfield, for example, even when I say Pollard, I'm responsible for the tiers at Establish the Run for our best ball package. And we'll be splitting them with Silva for our redraft package. And I make sure Spears and Pollard are in the same tier because honestly, they're probably both going to spike usable weeks underneath our noses, like randomly. I think that's going to happen with Arizona too. I'm not so much worried about Trey Benson having a standalone role when James Conner's healthy. But again, we can bet against James Conner's health, given what he's gone through in his career, something much more important, beating cancer as opposed to football. Thus, that's why his body is fragile and doesn't hold up over the course of a 17-game season. So I think both Conner and Benson will be usable. The only thing that's attractive about Benson, though, the best part about it, is that he is much more attainable than, say, a Jonathan Brooks in a much better environment, too, than Jonathan Brooks. So that's why I like Benson quite a bit. But honestly, I draft both of them. Again, I know it's cop-out, but I do draft both of them, just like the Steelers' backfield, where those two, Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris, are neck and neck. And honestly, again, I draft both of them because they're being drafted so closely every time I get there, especially because I'm very high on the Chiefs passing offense. I think we're getting an immense discount based on last year's results for Patrick Mahomes and company. And then you get to the mid-range and you're looking at, okay, if George Pickens goes this high and I can't fit him in with these Chiefs wide receivers because Hollywood and Xavier Worthy are going in the same range, how do I get my, championship week 17 exposure with the Steelers? And I always end up going one of Najee or Warren, but they get drafted so closely together, I have to mix it up just to make sure my exposure is flat. Otherwise, I'll just have 80% Warren, and it could be Najee instead, who runs away under Arthur Smith with the roll inside the 10-yard line. So I just think they're both usable. Same goes for the Cardinals backfield.
I don't think it is a cop-out. I think when best ball, it makes some sense because I think they're both going to have weeks, especially the Arizona one. And I think it can be a structural argument for your FFPC draft. If you're a hero RB team and you're getting an anchor sort of in the first round or maybe in the third round, occasional second round anchor, if you're a Jonathan Taylor believer, you can wait and take one of these guys like Conner in the 7th round. And then I want to combine him with some guys who I think will be peaking in the second half of the season, maybe some upside handcuffs, maybe some Marshawn Lloyds and Ty Chandler types. But I think I can plug James Conner in that first month of the season and get production out of him. And on the flip side, if I am a strong hero or if I'm a strong, robust RB build and I have like 2 or 3 really strong backs and Trey Benson is sitting there in the 9th round, and that is the absolute hammer pick where I could end up having the nuts team that nobody in my league can beat if it all comes together. So I think there's an argument for both those guys. One last backfield that rarely gets discussed on ambiguous backfields, but it's neck and neck. It's an offense that we think could be improved this year, and that's the Cleveland Browns. You have Nick Chubb at RB38, and the player that's been rising up, I know there's a lot of people with some sharp exposure to him, is Jerome Ford, who's all the way up to RB39. Ford filled in for Chubb last year, gave you low-end RB2 production, scored a lot of touchdowns, was an explosive play type player with a little bit of receiving upside. Nick Chubb on the flip side, if you're telling me that Nick Chubb beats his expectations for when he comes back from injury, he could be an appealing click for some. I don't have any Nick Chubb. I have a lot of Jerome Ford, so I'm hoping you tell me Jerome Ford's a really good pick right here, John.
I have no Nick Chubb. I have a lot of Jerome Ford.
Thank you.
What I don't think people are understanding is that the path, the runway for Jerome Ford is arguably longer. Not only for the ceiling purposes, the touch-based floor purposes in his range, because regardless of when Nick Chubb returns, let's say it's week 8, week 9, midway through the year, one, he could just be Javonte Williams last year, who was not usable. Javonte Williams got all the touches post his scary ACL injury, but clearly was not the same player at all. And then also the issue is Nick Chubb has never been a target earner for his entire career. He's relied solely on efficiency, carrying the ball, not catching it. So what happens to this player now who we believe will be inefficient and not earn targets? That's not someone I want to draft literally at all. And that's assuming, again, he returns mid-year. I don't think that's the correct assumption. So I think it's pretty easy to just avoid Nick Chubb, 0 shares altogether, and instead bet on Jerome Ford, and then later on, if you want to tack on Deontay Foreman, that's fine too, because we at least saw last year Kareem Hunt, although he never reached his ceiling any game that either Nick Chubb or Ford were healthy, Kareem Hunt still averaged double-digit touches per game once Nick Chubb went down to timeshare. So maybe that's Foreman's role, but also Foreman is another player who has not earned targets at all. So again, I think all we should be doing is elevating the floor and the longevity of his usability for Jerome Ford.
I love that you brought up the double tap, because I was going to bring up the double tap. I just need to have guests come on that sort of agree with me on things, because I had that written down.
Makes shows easier. Yeah.
It's so much easier. Like I really should just screen, hey, do you want to come on press coverage? Hey, what's your thoughts on DeVonta Achane? And if it's like, hey, I hate him at this year, I'd like, don't come on my show.
I knew you were on Zay Flowers. I didn't know you were high on Achane though. So that makes me feel a little better.
Achane is my guy.
Yeah.
Zay Flowers, I feel like it's me kind of against. There's a lot of smart people sort of fading Zay Flowers. I know Graham Barfield came out with some strong data showing why Zay Flowers is a fade. I'm sort of Zay Flowers looked really good to me last year. This was a first-round draft pick. Lamar Jackson had the most pass attempts we've ever seen him have in year 1 of the Todd Monken offense. And for me, the whole argument that Mark Andrews' return is going to somehow put Zay Flowers a little bit more in the back burner. Isaiah likely was scoring plenty of tight end points last year when Andrews was out. So it wasn't like we saw Zay Flowers struggle to put up points next to a tight end scoring fantasy points. I just also believe that Zay Flowers kind of profiles as a huge target earner, the kind of guy that can win, and the kind of guy that we've seen be very effective in PPR. I think he's going to add 20 receptions this year, and he's an easy click because I'm getting him now in wide receiver 3 land in a lot of drafts. So I kind of like the little zig where people are zagging, and I feel like if I am wrong, I'm not going to be very wrong. I think he still is a safe to stay in the range he's being drafted at. So I believe in the talent with Zay, and certainly a guy where was really impressive in that loss to the Chiefs. He had the fumble, but the guy was being featured and sort of having his moments against what we thought was a very good defense. So I'm on Zay. Click the button, John. Get some exposure to him. Tight end strategy. We brought up Andrews, and you talked about him, and we drafted against one another in the hardway draft, and you double tapped the position. Obviously, that draft is a monster. And that's not necessarily your strategy every single draft, but it was an interesting strategy, I thought. One thing that's interesting is you talked about the shifting values. Tight end is as cheap as it's ever been when we're looking at the context of tight end 1 overall. There's also more of an argument as to who should be the tight end 1 overall that we haven't seen the last few years. It's been Travis Kelce, pretty hands down the tight end 1. We had the 1 year where Mark Andrews was the tight end 1 and he was the chalk. Now it's Sam Laporta is most people's tight end 1, but I know that there's a lot of smart people who are making an argument for 3 or 4 other guys at the tight end 1 position, and there's some Kelce people still there as well. Who's your tight end 1, and what is your approach to this position the way it's being steamed this year?
I am going back to Kelce, but again, the way it's being drafted, I still will take my chances on Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts in this range where Travis Etienne and others tend to go. I'm always, especially on FFPC, where I get the extra half point for tight end premium scoring. I don't mind doing the double tap. That's also why I love doing FFPC drafts, because if I ever get boxed out or someone reaches on a player I wasn't expecting and my strategy goes away quickly, I know I can always fall back to tight end premium and feel comfortable there flexing one. But Travis Kelce for me, because as I alluded to earlier, I'm betting on the Chiefs offense to bounce back. I've been comparing it all offseason to buying Apple stock low, because everyone assumes like this is Patrick Mahomes' new offense, running the ball heavily and just tossing the ball shallow, hoping he gets yards after the catch, being an efficient game manager rather than a potent fantasy quarterback. I don't think that's the case, though, because last year we did see it was career lows, not only in touchdown rate, but points per game, 17.5 points per game for Mahomes. And he had never fallen below 20.5 prior to last season. It was also the first time the Chiefs offense threw for less than 30 passing touchdowns in any season since Alex Smith started under Andy Reid, since 2017. So I think we're just getting the bounce back. You also combine L'Jarius Sneed now being in Tennessee. L'Jarius Sneed is almost the entire reason that team was a top 3 defense whenever he played. So I think we're getting more shootouts as well. That way I can bet on Mahomes. Thus, I'm betting on Travis Kelce as my tight end 1. But again, Kyle Pitts, I still think is a full round too cheap. I bet by prime main event time in August, he definitely elevates to a second, third round turn kind of player. Everyone's going to eventually catch on that he's playing in a new offense with a new role. And then beyond that, again, Dalton Kincaid, Trey McBride, I don't mind taking chances on these guys over the available players around them in order to avoid the RB dead zone. So I just think that's how you're supposed to draft this year, honestly.
I'll throw out 4 guys pretty close in
Sure.
ADP, or at least positional ADP. Your favorite selection among Evan Engram at tight end 7, Jake Ferguson tight end 8, George Kittle tight end 9, David Njoku tight end 10, and Brock Bowers tight end 11. It's sort of a wide range, but Brock Bowers sort of becomes sort of the last of the Mohicans here, where he goes significantly higher than tight end 12 Dallas Goedert in these drafts. You never see Goddard being steamed into the 5th round. You do see Brock Bowers steamed in the 5th. So it's a wide range, John, and it could be 2 full rounds of coverage. But your favorite click in among those lower tight end ones?
I don't take much Evan Engram, although his role shouldn't change, at least as a PPR machine. He was used a lot like TJ Hawkinson, where all they did was run him on shallow routes and pelt him with balls. It's not like he was doing anything himself to add more of a ceiling. He was just getting lots of targets in the flat area of the field. And so I don't mind that floor, but I still wait because I think George Kittle's the one who's going a little too late. Everyone was betting on Ricky Pearsall post-draft to be this guy who catches all the falling targets if something were to happen to Deebo or Brandon Ayuk. But we've seen now 2 years of Brock Purdy. George Kittle is always the pivot if one of Deebo or Ayuk are off the field. He's the one Purdy leans on. So I still love the ceiling of Kittle. I know it's frustrating week to week because you can't really pinpoint it unless there are injuries within the offense, but I still love the spike week ability of George Kittle. So he is my favorite among them. I also usually don't mind Dallas Goedert because he is an every down player with no competition. Pretty easy to just bet on, considering he's going later than all these other guys.
There's been sort of a pro Dallas. So Dallas Goedert's the one where it just feels very vanilla to kind of draft him. But there is a stylistic, offensive coordinator upgrade. If you want to look back at some guys that have been successful with Kellen Moore, that could be the case here. Think back to like the Dalton Schultz in Dallas, now with Goedert. So Goedert's sort of an interesting one in that range. And I'll say Engram, one like sort of X factor is the changes at the wide receiver position, where they're working in 2 new big-bodied wide receivers. I think at least early on, you're going to get a significantly high target total for Engram. Also, to your point with the Travis Etienne, not necessarily fade for you, but you're not that excited about him. I think that if he's a little less successful as a touchdown scorer, there could be a little positive touchdown regression for Engram. I'm trying to make some arguments for my guy here.
Yeah, I get it. In terms of Travis Etienne, me fading him, like they definitely want Tank Bigsby to do something after spending important capital on him last year. But we've already seen it once again out of OTAs this year, fumbling, dropping balls, and that's exactly what he was. Anytime they gave him an opportunity last year, he just quite literally fumbled his chance, which is why his nickname became Tanking Bigsby. And so I've been betting on Dearness Johnson as a last round pick. Jaron Johnson was very good and outplayed Bigsby last year. So much so at the end of the year, they kept him active over Bigsby too. So that's kind of like my hedge over Travis Etienne. Etienne will probably get the majority of touches again. And it's going to come down to, once again, like falling into the end zone more for his touchdowns.
You alluded a little bit earlier to how you're clicking the button on Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts.
Yep.
One thing I find very interesting, though, is if we were having this discussion last year, and I believe we did have this discussion last year, was sort of one of the real takeaways from 2023 drafts was the return of early QB drafting. People were steaming up Josh Allen. You would sometimes see Josh Allen in like the second round of FFPC main events. And in turn, Jalen Hurts went right around him. Patrick Mahomes went right around them. And then there was the summer gravitational pull. The later we got in the summer, the more Lamar Jackson was getting pulled into the uber elite category. Now all these guys are cheaper. The whole market has adjusted quarterback. What is your approach now to quarterback? And you can specify which format or sort of a general idea. Are you looking to draft the elite players at a discount? Are you looking to dive into the QB1 middle class? Do you have some late round guys? Your general approach to QB, John.
And I believe I was on you last year and I was against the gravitational pull of elite quarterback because what happened, you can always rely on everyone drafting last year's results. Everyone comes into the year, just begins drafting what happened the previous year, which makes our job easy. We're guaranteed a job every year because as long as we don't just draft last year's results. What happened, though, was that in 2022, that's when Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, they became 3 of only 12 quarterbacks in the last decade. So only 12 in the last 10 years of all the quarterbacks have played to average at least 24 points per game. Everyone was then drafting those results, even though those results clearly, as 12 and 10 years, were not sustainable. It was not going to happen again. And so last year, I was very adamant about not drafting elite quarterback, thinking the QB1 comes closer to the QB12 because of those unsustainable results. And that's what happened. That's why CJ Stroud and Jordan Love were the 2 guys you saw in every single winning tournament roster because it didn't take elite capital to draft them. But now the elite guys fell backwards along with all the other positions we're talking about. So we're talking about, again, Jalen Hurts over players like T. Higgins, George Pickens, Travis Etienne, Rashad White. That's the easiest click in the world. Like to take literally Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts, players that break fantasy football, over guys you're just drafting to fill your wide receiver 2 or 3 or running back 2 or 3. Who cares? And so to me, I'm very much all the way back in on elite quarterback based on where they're going, especially because, again, the results last year, since they were not sustainable, and that proved as much, we saw the opposite end of the spectrum, where the QB 1 through 3 in ADP last season combined for just 21.6 points per game. They outscored Justin Herbert, the QB 12, by just 3 points per game, which is minimal based on the last decade, which was over 7 points per game. I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers out here, but just for reference, though, I am trying to tell you that unlike last year, we are now going to see the boomerang where elite quarterback should be the strategy this year, and it won't be because, again, everyone is only chasing last year.
I love the way you frame that, and I think that people appreciate the numbers. It's John, you're one of the better ones with pulling a very cool stat that I wasn't necessarily aware of. But yeah, the discrepancy with it's sort of the getting burned. And it's not necessarily the Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts drafter. Those guys were getting 15 rushing touchdowns in the spike weeks. It's the Patrick Mahomes drafter who drafted him as QB2 at the highest you've ever had to draft Mahomes. And he ends up giving you QB 10 in points per game. That drafter was sort of burned. And then when we see what Dak Prescott was able to do last year, And you referenced Jordan Love, you referenced CJ Stroud. It was sort of like a revenge of the quarterback, the late round quarterback. And you had multiple guys who were waiver wire starters, where Kyler Murray came off waiver wires. You were able to use him. You had multiple guys who like you could get by with it. So the edge was gone, but I agree with you. It's sort of back this year. Let's talk about your favorite. Oh, go ahead.
No, quickly, yeah. That's also why I'm on Mahomes over, like, of course I will draft Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts at this sudden 4th round discount we're getting every time. But for Mahomes, he's shown in the last 3 seasons, he's outscored each of Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, and Jalen Hurts, the rushing quarterbacks. He's outscored them at least once in each of the last 3 seasons. So, like, he, as the greatest quarterback of all time, Mahomes is also very capable in fantasy. If we're assuming a bounce back and a regression in his numbers, Mahomes can outscore those guys. Where I push back is I don't think CJ Stroud belongs in that group, because I don't know, as Mahomes is shown, again, as the greatest of all time, I don't know if Stroud is that for fantasy. As great as Stroud is, the fact he only averaged 2.3 rushing points per game, and only 7 top 5 quarterbacks since 2017, the last 5 years, have averaged fewer than 2.3 points per game. I don't know if CJ Stroud is worthy of a QB4 or QB5 overall. And I don't have a hard stance. He's my QB6 right behind Mahomes and Anthony Richardson. But I think Stroud's the one who could be the loser here, and that he literally has to be MVP. Like, that's his out. He has to win MVP in order to achieve and return the investment on his ADP. And although that's possible, that's what you're betting on, those long shot odds. So I think I'm going, whereas I'll be like severely overweight compared to the field on Achane, I do think I'm going to go into fantasy football with like the least amount of CJ Stroud out of anyone in tournaments, unfortunately.
I think you kind of nailed it, where Stroud is close enough to like the elite quarterbacks that you can just simply say, I'm going to take a guy like Lamar or Mahomes sort of a round and a half earlier. And it's not much of a projection, because Stroud, unless he creates a lot more opportunities with his legs and the game sort of becomes slow to him and he's able to fall in the end zone a few more times this year, that's sort of a big bet. I think that the argument for him is the talent of the wide receiver position, how effective he is as a passer. He's going to take this massive step forward, and he's going to lead the NFL in touchdown passes. But again, you're having to thread the needle on both of those in order to get like QB1. You've already seen it with Mahomes, and it's a simple one here. Just for everybody, it's simple. Game 1 last year, Justin Watson and MVS as his starting wide receivers. This year, Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy, with maybe Rashid Rice if he doesn't get the suspension, which he probably will for game 1. But it's like night and day.
Xavier Worthy, who had the lowest catchable pass rate of any wide receiver in this class coming out of Texas. Like, we don't know the ceiling of Xavier Worthy, since Quinn Ewers was so bad at throwing downfield. Now he has an extremely accurate quarterback downfield. What can Xavier Worthy put up? So I am really excited about the Chiefs passing offense this year, especially on a what is considered to be a down year based on ADP.
Yeah, I had Davis Maddock on Dynasty Life, and he says Mahomes is going to set the NFL record for passing touchdowns this year. So you are definitely not alone on that one, and definitely a fun one. Let's talk about busts, because you talked about Stroud busting at ADP, but you're still making a bullish case for him. But you have 2 running backs that you list as big busts. I'm on one of these guys as a fade right now, the other one not necessarily. But why don't you talk about your 2 busts at the running back position?
Josh Jacobs is definitely the first one. And I feel like every show I've gone on, I've had to talk about Josh Jacobs, just because he's the guy that people are touting for the contract and the offense. But remember that he's played 5 seasons in the league now, and the only time he finishes the top 12 running back in points per game in RB1 was the one season everyone's referring to. The other 4, he did not. Thus, we can consider that one an anomaly. Not only that, but the way our attention spans work as civilization now, everyone forgets that was only through 14 games. So now if you just say his last 18 games, because since then he's played a full season, 18 games, every number across the board is pretty much in line with Ezekiel Elliott's. Jacobs has been literally one of the worst backs in the entire league in his last 18 games. I really believe it's this curse of 390 plus touches, which I've talked about. You wear it And then the next time you play, at least the last 5 backs to do so in the last decade, Jacobs included, none of them reached even 315 touches. I think, whereas everyone's assuming a bounce back based on this contract situation, I think Jacobs is going along the line of DeMarco Murray and Le'Veon Bell and being dust and burnt out, as opposed to being someone who bounces back now. We're also getting rumors or reports out of Packers OTAs about Matt LaFleur running more of a committee, as he's usually done with a pass catching opportunity. So I don't know if Jacobs' role is guaranteed either to be this workhorse back all of a sudden. So I think Jacobs in his range is a pretty fadeable player, honestly.
Marshawn Lloyd has been one of my most drafted players in every single format. And I think you also bring up the fact that it's a committee backfield, and a lot of committee backfields, a back like Jacobs, it would be it's okay because he's going to run for all the touchdowns. It's okay because the back behind him maybe is a slight pass catching running back. Marshawn Lloyd's 225, and Marshawn Lloyd's has juice, and Marshawn Lloyd also projects as a guy who can catch the football. So it sort of limits Jacobs' ceiling as a receiver. It also limits his ceiling, I believe, as a runner, because it's going to be hard for them not to give, even if it's just an A.J. Dillon usage for a player like Marshawn Lloyd. I feel like he's going to be a much better bet at ADP than Jacobs. So I'm with you on that. Fade Josh Jacobs, draft Marshawn Lloyd.
The Packers were also a top 5 offense in the last 10 years of efficiency, like on touchdown rate inside the 5-yard line. I don't know, although we're assuming they're going to grow, I really don't know what the Packers offense is. That's my issue too. I think they'll be very good, but Jordan Love, even last year, first half of the season, he should have been benched. He was quite literally terrible. And I really did think they were going to bench him. Then he came back, softer schedule. They changed up play calling a little bit to make him adaptable. And he got a lot more courageous under pressure too. Jordan Love had an entirely different second half of the season of 21 touchdowns and just 5 picks, literally a different player. So I just don't know like who Jordan Love is after he was benchable. And then he became Joe Flacco on the Super Bowl run, like untouchable. I would like to see like who he is as a player, what this offense becomes. And I don't think it has as high of a ceiling as everyone's assuming that Jacobs just falls into, even if he were good.
I think it was that Saints game where they were down like 17-0, and then Love led them back. It was like an 18-17 win.
Yeah.
And then Love started playing better after that. So yeah, that's definitely an interesting one there. Your other fade, this is a player that is very polarizing for many, and it's Zamir White. Josh Jacobs backup last year. He had the 4-game sample size, played really well for 4 games, or not necessarily a world beater, but 4 top 20 or better running back weeks. They draft Dylan Lobby late. They sign Alexander Mattison. You are fading Zamir White.
I absolutely am, because it's never a good reason to draft a player when you're just arguing their touches. Zamir White also is not that player. He maxed out at 169 touches in each of his 3 seasons at Georgia, never got more than that those 3 seasons, and then has only earned 136 touches through 2 NFL seasons. Last year in that 4-game stretch everyone talks about, that's why they're drafting him high, he ran just 17 more routes than Amir Abdullah because he wasn't the pass catching back. He wasn't even an every down option. So since the Raiders under Antonio Pierce were the number 1 defense for fantasy, like what happens in game scripts where they aren't allowed to do that? Like they're not playing the Chiefs on Christmas, the Chiefs who don't even show up because they've already made the playoffs. They don't care at all. Like they just don't have this run out of such an easy schedule. What happens to Zamir White then? And those are the types of players that are the easiest to fade at their ADPs whenever they're drafted high. So to me, it's not even about Zamir White. I won't have any shares. It's going to be about, as crazy as this is, like, we wanted to draft Alexander Mattison. People wanted to draft Alexander Mattison in the 6th round last year. Now you can get him in the 15th or 18th round. And it's also a hedge against the player who is Mattison this year, a player who doesn't belong in this bucket. So I draft a lot more Alexander Mattison than I do Zamir White based on the price and roles.
2023, Alexander Mattison shares died. So 2024, Alexander Mattison shares could
That's
live.
true. Yeah.
Let's keep this going. You talked about your ADP steals. Guys you listed here, you talked for about 10 seconds on Zach Moss. So let's talk about why he's a steal at ADP. And I'll say Adam Levitan, your co-worker at Establish the Run, when he came on press coverage months ago, he was talking about how bullish he was on Zach Moss. Very mixed opinions on this backfield. I've had other guests who are fading Moss and are into Chase Brown. Your thoughts on Zach Moss? Is it so much of a he's going to fall in the end zone a lot of times? Or is it a can he be like a Joe Mixon light type role?
The fact that Chase Brown wasn't even the third down option over Joe Mixon last year, he just intermittently worked in whenever he became healthy. It's always concerning when a rookie can't earn a role in general in their first year. Whereas Zach Moss, again, has been treated like a workhorse in two different locations. Most recently, Indianapolis, where he had 2 seasons whenever Jonathan Taylor was hurt. In those 6 full games Moss played, he averaged 23 carries and 2.5 targets per game. Like, he earned the workhorse role, even though he was inefficient the first month he played for Taylor, came back for 2 starts, was the old Zach Moss. But the fact is, coaches trust him. And I'll just always take a bet on that, a workhorse, as opposed to, again, an undersized day 3 option. I went on JJ Zacharyason's podcast, Late Round Perspectives, last week. And so it's still fresh if anyone wants to jump on there and listen. And we talked about the situation. And JJ in particular talked about just his model and the outlook for day 3 undersized options. It's just a bucket we should be betting against every time. And so, again, while I will sprinkle in some Chase Brown because I understand probabilities and best ball not being overweight too much on individual players, I do think the situation, like, the stars align for Zach Moss to be the guy to target there.
Interesting one. And I think that's one where, based on their price points and based on we think this is going to be an upper half offense, if not a top 10 offense, there's going to be an ADP winner here, and it's going to help drafters. So John Daigle, absolutely on Zach Moss.
And to put my hand in the dirt, like Joe Burrow coming off of back-to-back injured seasons, finally at what we believe is at full strength. Like, it's pretty hard to trust the poor pass blocking back out there protecting Burrow for what is a questionable offensive line. Like, you would think Zach Moss is going to come out favored anyhow, despite never working with his coaching staff. So yes, you can stamp it. I like Moss quite a bit more than Chase Brown.
One player who was a major ADP winner last year, you were drafting him around, let's call it RB27 land, just outside of RB2 land, even in late August drafts, was David Montgomery. The Detroit Lions have finished 5th in the NFL in back-to-back seasons in scoring. We've seen back-to-back seasons where 2 Lions running backs finished as RB2 or better under Ben Johnson, and you are certainly back on that now. David Montgomery, it's adjusted. He's RB21 in ADP, but he hasn't really steamed up. That's RB21. You're still seeing him in like the 7th round.
And I believe everyone forgets that there were 2 stints. Like, David Montgomery was injured. That's when Jahmyr Gibbs broke out and earned himself a role after the bye. Jahmyr Gibbs was also injured. David Montgomery became an every down workhorse. But what happened was they played 10 games together, including the postseason after their bye. And in those 10 games, David Montgomery actually recorded 10 more touches total than Jahmyr Gibbs. He doesn't go away. He's not more explosive than Gibbs, obviously, but Montgomery is there because he's just good enough to stay on the field alongside Gibbs. So the fact that he's just kind of left over in a potent offense that plays indoors for practically every game until, unfortunately, week 16 and 17, the final 2 rounds of best ball. Of course, I want exposure there, and he's the cheapest exposure. So I do love David Montgomery, as you can usually get him in RB2, even if you start out with an anchor or hero RB build.
Yeah, I had him as a target of mine. I did a dead zone running back targets and fades, and he's right there. It's sort of a people want to fade him. I think that you're not going to have to worry about Jahmyr Gibbs starting slow out the gate, and I think Gibbs is absolutely deserving of where he's being drafted. But when you look at that offense as a whole, it's just this could be the top scoring offense in the NFL. David Montgomery is really, really good in it. And having 2 running backs sort of complement one another has been sort of the MO for Ben Johnson for back-to-back years. The price is absolutely right for David Montgomery to return value on where you having to draft him. You've got one more player on this list, a non-quarterback, that is a little bit off the beaten path here, but Rashid Shaheed. Talk about why you think Shaheed is going to have a really big year 3 of his NFL career.
Saints are finally changing offenses. They previously had the same OC or at least play caller under Sean Payton too for I don't think people realize they had the same guy for 20 years. It's been a long time. So we're finally going to see just an entirely different offense for New Orleans. And I think with Michael Thomas out of the way, that entails Rashid Shaheed in 2 wide sets. And despite having limited opportunity over the last 2 years, he actually ranks 19th in yards per out run among every receiver the last 2 seasons. He's like who everyone wants Jameson Williams to be. Shaheed's already there without a role. Now what happens when we give him a role alongside Chris Olave? Like, I don't know what the limit is. Like maybe it's the sky. So Shaheed's one I'm always betting on, especially when you talk about indoor environments. We obviously get a lot of indoor between the Saints at home and the fact they have some domes like the Falcons included in their schedule, whether it's in their division or not. So I like Shaheed quite a bit.
Yeah, I love the argument for him. And it's sort of now you have Juwan Johnson hurt for a significant period of time. Yep. There's just, besides Chris Olave and Alvin Kamara, there's so many question marks about this offense, and betting on a guy to get a weekly consistent role, I think he's right there. And I also think there's people who really like A.T. Perry. There's people who like Bub Means. There's always Taysom Hill people, Kenry Miller people, but Shaheed, there's not a whole lot of like buzz. So I think that's a very educated argument for drafting him at cost. You already talked about Patrick Mahomes. You have him as an ADP steal, but if there's anything else you want to add to him, John, or talk about a couple of these must-draft players.
I honestly already said I unloaded the tank on Patrick Mahomes, so everything I mentioned earlier, just know, yes, I am very much ahead of them, and he's easily stackable because Travis Kelce, Marquise Brown typically go in that range or earlier. And once Travis Kelce in particular goes off the board, no one's really trying to grab Mahomes because since his receivers go so late, he's unstackable then to the rest of the board. He usually falls a full round, a round and a half after you take Kelce. So just know Mahomes stacks, while they're my favorite, they're also very easily buildable right now.
I love it. And we're going to talk about your 3 must-draft players. And you talked about 2 of these running backs, but you're listing 2 running backs who are going right around one another with Achane and Kyren Williams. Do you have a preference of the 2, or is it I want exposure to both?
It's Achane over Kyren, but I'm still taking Kyren. I think both outscore Saquon Barkley. I don't think that's a hot take either. Their roles, their offenses, I think are just outright better. The fact that even DeAndre Swift's target share, although he opened up as an option they were passing to underneath, even DeAndre Swift's target share faded as the season went along because that's just not how Philadelphia's offense operates through their running back. So I don't know what Saquon Barkley's ceiling will be, especially since Jalen Hurts is the one who's led that team and carries inside the 5-yard line for 3 consecutive seasons now. So I want to bet against Barkley. Achane and Kyren, in my opinion, should be ranked higher anyways over him. They're just going a round or 2 later. So I'm always betting on those 2 for running backs. And I've pretty much mentioned everything. I know right now Kyren's the one getting depressed ADP because of the addition of Blake Corum. But given Sean McVay's history of leaning on one running back, that is something I'm still willing to bet on with Kyren, especially at a discount now.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the discount because when second round Kyren was sort of the norm, I was not able to click that button. But even if I'm fading him, I want a little bit of exposure when you're starting to see him in like the late 3rd round, early 4th. You bring up just how effective the RB1 is in a Sean McVay offense. And we all saw it last year with Kyren, just how great he was. It was a league winner last year. And now the opportunity cost is not the 2nd round. It's like the late 3rd. And we've seen it a couple of times where he's touched the 4th. I think that'll correct. I think he'll settle into the 3rd when we're in like main event season. But you're starting to be a little bit on an island. There's a lot of faders right there for Kyren Williams. And I think you're making a strong point. One player that your last sort of ADP, your last must draft player, this is an exciting one. It's a quarterback. Why don't you talk about him?
If you miss out on the elite quarterbacks, which I'm still going to promote across the offseason, I think that's the way of fantasy football in 2024. You at least have Jaden Daniels waiting in the back and as a fringe QB1. And we've had to go through 2 different seasons now. We've had to go through Jayden Daniels' pressure to sack ratio as a rookie and everyone questioning his ceiling. But then even if he doesn't pan out as a prospect, you have to step back and ask, how do you win this dumb little game we play? And you win this dumb little game by betting on rushing quarterbacks and amazing opportunities. And that's exactly what Daniels fell into. 9.7 rushing points per game for his career at LSU. Not only that, but as a rushing quarterback, remember, Cliff Kingsbury, when in the 4 years coordinating for Arizona, because of the way his offense operates, they faced the lowest rate of 8-man boxes in the NFL because it just spreads everything out. So now we think we're going to get a spread, fast-paced offense for Jayden Daniels to have some clear lanes to run. Also, the caveat is remember who Dan Quinn is as a head coach, because although he's been amazing, like Wade Phillips, Norv Turner, Adam Gase, at his one role, when he's had that one role, whenever he takes on a head coaching role, it was just far too much for him to handle. And that's why his defenses in Atlanta through 6 seasons never ranked top 16 in EPA per play. They were always poor units. So I think we're getting a spread offense with a 17-game rushing quarterback that's fast-paced with a poor defensive head coach and poor defense altogether. So the stars align for Jayden Daniels.
I love it. We've talked about Jayden Daniels on First Class Fantasy and here on Press Coverage. It's like a cheat code. Everything you sort of want from Anthony Richardson, where you have to draft him at QB6, you're getting as a runner with Jayden Daniels. And like you said, I think the Cliff Kingsbury offense is a really nice fit. Nothing but positive vibes coming out of Washington right now with sort of his chemistry with Terry McLaurin, sort of a Jahan Dotson potential bounce back, and, Luke McCaffrey. People in Washington are excited about that as well. You should be excited about following John Daigle's content. John, you were generous with your time and your takes. A lot of fun. Let everybody know where they can find your work.
Establish the Run. We are currently refreshing the best ball package 2 or 3 times per day now. The Slack arguments are to be had. I'm still working on getting the Slack discussions as content, because there are a lot of heated arguments that go down in there that I wish everyone could see both sides and both takes, until like one of us eventually plays a meme of myself saying it's not that simple, Leone, and just yelling at everyone else. But that's where I am right now. Again, about to start splitting and working on redraft season-long content with Silva. So stay tuned for all of that.
Yeah, and you guys are continually bringing out sharp, actionable content over Establish the Run. Mike Leone will be on with us at some point this summer. I always podcast with him. Really, really a big fan of his work. Make sure you're following John and everything that he does. Stick with us here at Press Coverage. We're going to be bringing in the sharpest guests that we can find in all of fantasy football. Dwayne McFarland is my next guest. We'll drop that one before 4th of July. So I'll talk to you soon, and we will see you soon right back at Press Coverage.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.